Well, Angela, thank you so much for being here today with us on the podcast. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, and I feel that your work is so unique because you've been able to combine both the academic world and the business world in a way that not many have before. And just in my experience, a lot of times when a professor writes a book, sometimes it maybe can sound a bit out of touch or maybe too theoretical to understand. But the way that you've been able to weave the research, the data, stories, and narrative is very powerful. The way that it speaks is just amazing. And I think, and I wanted to ask you this, I think it might partly be because of your background. You have a unique background where you started off in management consulting at McKinsey, if I remember right. And then you decided at age 27 to leave the consulting world and to start teaching, which I think for most consultants is not the standard career path most people do. So I'm really curious what drew you to teaching. What made you make that decision?
When I left McKinsey to teach, it was in a way, the surprise was that I had even been in consulting in the first place, because the chapter that came before McKinsey was that I had been tutoring and working with kids really like, I don't know. I mean, really as far back as I can remember, as a high school student, as a college student. And the first 2 years out of college, I started an enrichment program, like a tuition-free summer school for kids in the, community near my college. And so in a way, it was McKinsey that was the digression, the kind of like, what? Like, what non sequitur is this in the story of your life? And going into the classroom to become a math teacher, first in middle school and then in high school, that was kind of like the main plot. I mean, that made a lot more sense if you were going to make a screenplay out of it. So I would say that this toggling, though, between, being a classroom educator, then being a consultant, then, sort of going back and forth between these worlds, because I was kids and then like business. I gave me one very distinct impression, which is that whether you're a teacher or you're a CEO, it's the same job, right? Like you're trying to help people become better, and you're trying to help them fulfill their wishes and their dreams. And so I have found it even more the case that like everyone really has the same job when I became a mother, right? It's like all of us really are trying to become the best people that we are. And also so much of the time that includes helping the people that we care about, whether they're working for us, whether they're our students or whether they're our children, like do the same.
That's a great answer. I was just curious kind of why that decision was made, and obviously we're grateful for it. So the other question I had was, did you always have an aspiration to write a book in your life? And then like as you started studying, you thought, okay, this is going to be the topic I want, or was it more that once you started researching and studying, then you're like, either felt compelled or other people were saying you need to write a book about this? I'm just curious, why'd you write it? Yeah.
I'm going to tell you like the secret backstory of writing this book. And by the way, just thank you. Your words are, very kind. And I will say that the story begins with my husband, because my husband, Jason, came home one day and he said, and this is years ago, this is certainly before I wrote the book. He said, you should write something. You should write a book on grit. And I thought to myself, like, first of all, books are so long. Like I could not picture mentally like actually writing one. It just seemed to me like you may as well have said like, hey, you should climb to the top of Mount Everest in flip-flops, right? Like I was just like, that's absurd. It's ridiculous. I don't know who writes all these books, but I couldn't do it. I can't. The other thing is I felt like I was, maybe like too junior to like, write a book with authority. So for all these reasons, I said, no. Then a few days later, he came home and he said, if you don't write this book, somebody else is going to write this book and they're going to call it Grit. and you're going to be really annoyed because it's not going to say the things that you want it to say. And literally it was that argument. I was like, okay, fine, I'll write a book. So I was very reluctant. I dragged my feet. The whole time I was writing, it took a year end to end. I cried maybe half the days. I don't know if it was most days, but like
Wow.
one day out of two, like tears, like I had temper tantrums. I would remind my husband that it was really his idea and like he had ruined my life. I said to him, like, probably I won't even live as long because it's been so stressful. Like I'll probably live 5 years less than I would have. But now that I can look back, I will say that, your grandfather's book, which I've read, and so many other books that I think we probably have both read, if we ask ourselves, like, did we learn something? And will that thing that we learn really stay with us, like in some meaningful way? Honestly, I have to say yes to that, and in answer to that question. Also, like, I really don't know of another like technology, if you will, than books that to like deliver human insight from one person to another as well as books do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that really goes along with why I wanted to start this podcast in the first place. And specifically, the reason I've called it paradigm shifting books is because I feel like paradigms, and this is something my grandpa just always harped on, was he would always talk about the power of paradigms. And so for me, this book on grit was a huge paradigm shift for me. I mean, I grew up playing American football, right? So I heard the term grit a lot. Either a coach was pointing out a player and saying, that guy's got grit, or the coach was berating me or my teammates saying, you need more grit. So I always thought, I just thought of grit as, just toughness and never quitting. Was just kind of how I grew up with it. But how do you go about defining grit in the book?
I define grit in a way that might actually be a little different than the way the word was used, like in the movies and maybe on the sports fields. So I define grit as the combination of perseverance and passion for long-term goals. So what grit sounds like is just perseverance for long-term goals, like stick with it, even on a bad day, like work hard, work on your weaknesses, tough it out. I think those are elements of perseverance that are part of grit. But this other half of passion is really about loving what you do for a very long time. Like, let's just take, I'll just use myself as an example. I go to bed at night and I, like when I go to bed, I'm kind of like thinking about, psychology. Right. And then in the middle of the night, if I have to get up and get a drink of water or go to the bathroom, like in my dreams, I'm actually thinking about psychology. And I know that because in that moment of awareness, like just when you're like, you realize that you're dreaming about your work. And then when I wake up in the morning and I almost want to like run downstairs, like to get started, it's because I really love what I do. And I think when people think of grit, they might think of like gritting your teeth, determination, doing things that you don't like. That sometimes is necessary, but even if you're doing things you don't like, it's because the project is something that you love. So if we could, embrace that, I think, we might say different things to our kids, and we might lead a different way. And the reason I care about both of these things, not only the perseverance, but the passion, is because in my research, when I study, super achievers, they don't just have perseverance for long-term goals. They also have passion for long-term goals. And I have to say, like, I think that's at least as important.
Yeah. And what would you say, in the book, you explain it brilliantly, and obviously we can't talk about everything in your book today, but with passion, I was curious, someone maybe who's listening to this towards the start of their career, and this idea of passion. I mean, a lot of times you'll see in a movie or you'll hear stories where it's like, oh, and then I knew in that moment I had the passion for this, an epiphany, right?
Lightning.
But in your book, you talk about that. That's not always the case, how that happens. In fact, for most people, that's probably not how it happens. I'm curious what your research showed and kind of what you say in the book about that.
The development of a passion is probably a better way to even phrase this process than the discovery of a passion. And in the movies, it really does happen in usually one scene, and there's music, and before that scene, the protagonist is like struggling and wandering, and then after that scene it's like, oh great, like now I know I want to be a chef, like, and from that moment on I knew I was going to be a ballet dancer, right? That's very romantic, and maybe that does happen occasionally, but I think the vast majority of us grow into, develop, mature, evolve into our eventual passions. And again, just to use my own life story as an example, I went to graduate school when I was 32 years old. I was pregnant with my second daughter. I had already had one daughter. So I was, frankly, not in a very convenient period of life. Like, why did I not go till I was 32? Is it because I had an epiphany when I was 31? Not quite. It was really a gradual realization and a gradual development of like a kind of a deepening interest in human nature. And then when I went to graduate school, I'll tell you, like, it continued to evolve and mature. And so in a way, it was much more like marriage, you might think like, oh, you can fall in love with somebody in 5 minutes. Well, you can feel very attracted to someone in 5 minutes, but I don't think you can develop a relationship with a person in 5 minutes. And if you think about passion as more of a ongoing, evolving relationship, then it makes you realize that it could take years of, exploring and then deepening and trying things out, which is why young people, and by that, I mean, not only, teenagers and children, but really like young adults in their 20s, for example, need to have a little bit of patience, I think. And maybe these words will help them be less terrified that they don't yet have a quote unquote passion, because it does take time. And for most people, in my experience, it takes years.
Another thing I really liked in your book is when you talk about kind of society's preoccupation with talent, like natural born talent. Why we as a society, why do we like the stories of the talented individuals, the prodigies, the Mozarts, where we just love this person that just emerges and they're like, hey man, he's so much talent. Look at the way he performs. So I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about what you found in your research as far as why do people love the talent, and then sometimes they look at the hard work and like, oh yeah, that person worked hard, but what I love is the story of the talent.
Talent is such an interesting word. It is almost magical, isn't it? Right? Everybody wants to be called talented, and we have gifted and talented programs. We have talent shows, and companies always talk about like winning the war for talent. And as you may know, the word itself goes back to biblical times, and the meaning literally was a measure of silver or gold. So like it meant value, right? But now in modern times, we use it in this kind of mystical sense to mean like kind of like everything that you want someone to be, like it rolls off our tongue in so many different circumstances that honestly I don't know that we really specifically know what we mean, except for that it's good and that we all want to be it, and it has something to do with being an achiever. The person who's taught me the most about this word talent and how we use it and how we sometimes misuse it, I think, is a guy named Danny Southwick, who, like you, played football a lot in his life. And he was pro for short time, I think for the Oakland Raiders. And improbably, he is now my graduate student. So I have to say he's probably like the only NFL quarterback in history to ever enter the PhD program, at least at an Ivy League school. And what Danny Southwick, his name, is trying to understand is like why we love this word talent, what it means to us when we hear it, what it makes us feel, and what's really going on in terms of achievement. And what Danny's discovered in his research is that this word talent has these connotations of being born, not made, innate, not learned. And when we hear this word, it can demotivate us, especially if we feel like we don't have the talent to do something. When Danny was a football player, he remembers distinctly one coach saying to him, look, I've been doing this for 30 years. And I got to tell you, you've got the talent to succeed in this league. And then almost the very next day, another coach watching him play said, look, I've been doing this for decades. And I got to tell you, you don't have the talent that takes. So I think that it can really be a word that is like a dangerous word to use, because it has so much of this connotation of innateness, and it's so weighty. I think what we want to say, both Danny and I, is that when you look at true human excellence, Tom Brady, if you want to take one of Danny's heroes in football, or for me, like Carol Dweck, or like you could think of like your favorite movie star. I mean, a great CEO or leader or community activist. If you look at excellence in any human endeavor, whatever it is that talent is or isn't, it's undeniable. And the scientific research is very clear that you cannot achieve those heights of human excellence in anything without thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of hard work, of working on weaknesses, of getting feedback, of calibrating, of like going to bed, thinking about how to do it better the next day, of resting and trying again, like trying new tactic. And that to me is, a much more complicated story. And the reason Danny and I think that there's this romance with talent, especially in the United States, is that when you believe that somebody has accomplished what they've accomplished because they're talented, if you believe that Tom Brady is different from you because he's talented and you're not, then you don't have to try so hard because there's no game to win. But I think the responsibility is on all of us to say, look, so much of our success in life is really about what we do and not about what we were born with. And therefore, it is this long, hard road to climb or a road to, to till. But I think that's the truth of it. So that was a little speech on talent. And, I'm glad you asked it. And of course, to me, it's very much why I began studying grit in the first place, because I had the intuition that it couldn't be just talent that made people successful in life.
Yeah, no, I really like it. And I think the way the formulas that you put together in the book, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's you count effort twice in the formulas, right? It's talent times effort equals skill, and then skill times effort equals achievement. I like the way that you kind of simplified that in those formulas where effort counts twice. That kind of stuck with me, as I read it. And you mentioned it a little, but are people born with grit? Are some people naturally more grittier than other people? And then is it something, can you grow grit, or is it just, you're born with what you have and that's it?
Okay, so I'm going to try to do two things. One is I'm just going to say about those equations. One thing that's missing from those equations, and I think I wrote it in the text, but sometimes people just look at the picture and they don't look at the words around the picture. And I'll just say that one thing that's missing is opportunity, right? And I've often been asked, like, wait a second, what if you try really hard and you're really talented and you're born, in a society or to a position or in a country that there isn't opportunity? And I just wanted to honor that criticism because I think that's right and legitimate. And I just wrote around the picture, like, oh, by the way, this little formula leaves out opportunity. That's really important because as a psychologist, I don't really study it as much. But anyway, I think that criticism of the equation in my work is legitimate. So I just wanted to say that, there's a limitation there. And then in terms of, who we are and how much of who we are is our genes that we inherit from our mother and our father, our biological mother and father, our DNA. How much of it is nature? How much of it is nurture? Our early experiences, who we had for our fifth grade, teacher, like who our best friend was, the summer camp we went to, like who our first boss was, how much is like our character developed by nature versus nurture? And the simple answer, although like any simple answer, there's a more complex answer, which is a little more precise, but I'll just start with simple, is that there's nothing about you, Stephen, or me, or anybody that we know that's not both. It's not the right question to ask, is it nature or nurture? Because the answer is that it's nature and nurture, right? And then the question is like, well, how much? Like, is it 60-40? Is it 80-20? Is it like, 10-90? Like, what's the ratio? And I would have to give you a much longer answer that would require a little bit too much time. But I would say that roughly half of the variation in any characteristic that you could think of, grit, extroversion, whether you like to eat broccoli or not. These are things that people vary on. And about half of that variation can be explained by nature, by your genes. And then about half of it by your nurture, by your experiences, by your environment. And there's a lot more to say there, but I'll just say that, that tells me as a mother that I could wake up every morning and think like, why are Amanda and Lucy like doing that? Well, there's her dad's genes right there. Like, or I could think like, if what we do in life is always in part determined by experience and environment, then my job as a mother is to create an environment that helps my two daughters cultivate character in the ways that I know I can. So the genes are important to acknowledge, but I will just say I hope they don't end up being a distraction from the part of the story that we can control.
Yeah, no, that's so insightful. And I remember when I read the book for the first time, I really liked when you talked about the idea of, well, you can't teach height, right? You can't teach height. But in reality, it kind of threw me for a loop a little, because you look at the average height of people, 100, 200 years ago. And I can't remember, I think it was British troops or something, where you showed that the height difference over time, and that what contributed to that was better eating habits and better medicine. And there was a number of things that actually did have an impact on that. So that was kind of like, for me, I was like, wow, because that's something you hear, at least in sports, right? It's always like, oh, we can't teach height, you can't teach speed, things like that. But that was pretty unique when I read
Now,
that.
look, if you got an athlete and they're 22, you aren't going to make them taller, right? Because they're done growing, right? So I think that, when coaches say, I can't teach height, it's like, well, the kid's done growing, and sure, I think that's true. By the way, Steph Curry isn't the tallest guy in the world either. And he has like one of the, best shooting records in history, if not the best by some metrics. So I think there's this kind of like, what you can't teach and what you can. I mean, on my bedside, we're both lovers of books, and, I think both of us, have a real respect for books that help people, develop themselves personally. Well, one of the oldest of these is the writings of, it's actually the teachings of Epictetus, the ancient Roman Stoic philosopher. And it's actually, I think, one of his proteges who wrote down all the things that Epictetus wisely said. And, the very opening of this volume that I'm reading is there are things in life that you can change, and there are things in life that you can't. And I think that sentence says that okay, these things are true. Some things you can't direct, like a coach cannot change a 22-year-old's height. But a coach can change a lot of other things. And I think the question is, are we going to do what Epictetus told us to do, which is that it's very useful in life to acknowledge what you cannot change, and then to focus your energy on what you can. And so, this nature nurture thing to me is sometimes, a way for people to, make excuses to themselves about the things that they can't change. Like, you can't change your genes, your risk for heart disease, your family has a history of, cancer. But guess what? You can change what you're going to eat for breakfast the next morning, right? And you can change so much else.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about, I love the way that you organize the book, where you first kind of give a new paradigm for what grit is, explain about it, and then you start with the inside out approach, which is a very similar approach my grandpa always took with his stuff, and then you do the outside in approach. But when you talk about developing grit from the inside out, you mentioned that there's kind of 4 key psychological characteristics that paragons of grit have: interest, practice, purpose, and hope. So what I'm hoping is maybe we could go a minute or two on each one and just kind of get the high level. So on interest, what stood out to me, and then I'd love to hear you say it yourself, but this idea of being interest, you're being triggered by interactions with the outside world, and that interest leads to passion. I know you mentioned a little bit of this before, but this idea of interest.
Interest is an emotion, and we know what it feels like to be interested. Like, I'm interested in what you're saying still. I'm like, what's he going to say next? And you have my attention, and you have it voluntarily, and you have it spontaneously. And that's when we're interested, what it feels like. You feel energized, you feel engaged, and you don't feel like it's anything you have to work on. Boredom, by the way, is the opposite, right? It's like when we're bored, it's like you have to force yourself to look up. You have to your head starts nodding, your mind starts wandering. So when I say that interest is the, the root of passion, what I mean is that, the very beginnings of like eventually loving something, I think does start with like, gosh, this subject engages me spontaneously and effortlessly. Like I want to pay attention to it. For me, human nature, behavior, like why people do what they do, where emotions come from, that all is to me interesting. I think it's probably less interesting to some other people who don't want to become psychologists, right? For other people, they might be like really interested in finance or like interested in history or interested in politics. I have an interest also in food, by the way. Like I really love like food, and I like read all these like cookbooks, and I sometimes read like restaurant reviews, which is kind of silly because I never go to restaurants, and I read food essays. So food is another topic which spontaneously grabs my attention. And I think that we're not able usually to pursue all of our interests when we choose a career path, right? Like I wasn't able to like braid together my interest in human behavior with my interest in food, but I was able to braid together my interest in human behavior with my interest in writing. Right? I love words. I love writing. Every time I read a book like you, I'm like always like, oh, how'd they structure this? Like, oh, I love that first sentence. Like, wow, that's a really beautiful phrase. So I will just say that in terms of building grit from the inside out, one of the first things that you can do is say, can I notice where my attention spontaneously goes? What are the subjects that grab me and energize me? And I think that's a very good place to begin with, where your eventual passions will develop.
The second one is practice. Again, what kind of my high level notes was it's not just about practice itself, right? I mean, practice is important, but the key is the deliberate practice. That the deliberate practice affects a person's behavior. And then you also talk about flow, which is more of like an experience that someone has. But anyway, so that's my high level notes, but I'm
good job.
Curious to hear from you.
I feel like I'm giving you the final exam on grit. And I think you're doing very well. So I presented practice next because when you look at the childhoods and the developmental years of people who eventually we would say, wow, Lindsey Vonn, paragon of grit, Steph Curry, paragon of grit. Usually you can find this pattern where there's some interest at the beginning, which, as I said, is kind of playful, like independent. It wasn't forced on these people at all. An interest in basketball, an interest in skiing, an interest in writing, etc. Then the next stage of development is practice, and that's when you are doing the kind of practice, especially the kind of deliberate practice that Anders Ericsson, who passed away actually not many months ago. He was a cognitive scientist who spent his whole life studying the development of expertise as a cognitive scientist. And what he discovered was that not all practice is the same. So when you're in this stage of your development, what you want to do is to emulate people like Lindsey Vonn or Steph Curry, and you want to practice with intentionality. So these experts set goals for improvement that are very specific and actually are not too ambitious. One of the myths of practicing is people think you have to do things that are like really, 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 really hard, but you don't want to reach too far. You want to get like just beyond what you can do at the moment. And then you have to practice whatever you're doing with complete concentration. And then, as Anders would always tell the people that he was working with, you have to get feedback. If you don't get feedback, you can't improve. If Steph Curry can't see whether the shot went in or didn't, like he can't improve. If Lindsey Vonn doesn't know how many seconds were like, her last run down the hill, she can't improve. So I think this second stage of the development of grit is a kind of seriousness of trying to get better. Like it's discovering the craft of what you do. And I do think it's something that most of us can learn from, because not many of us are practicing deliberately in a very disciplined kind of like consistent way. We might do it like, on a Tuesday, and then it's like 6 days go by and then it's like, oh gosh, I haven't. So I think the secret to deliberate practice is not only to understand it, but also to ritualize it so that it's a part of your daily routine.
That's so powerful. And then the third one you mentioned is purpose. And the big one I remember from the book is the story of the bricklayers, right? There's three people laying bricks, And the first one, someone asks him, what are you doing? He says, I'm laying bricks. And they ask the second person, and he says, I'm building a church. And then you ask the third person, and he says, I'm building a house of God. So it's kind of like three different levels of purpose is kind of how I took it away. So why did you include purpose as number three?
Well, the parable of the bricklayers really does have so much to teach us about life. And this third chapter, if you will, of someone's story as they develop grit that, began with the chapter on interest. And then, then they begin to practice, seriously. And then this third stage is really something that sometimes is only achieved in middle to late adulthood. I think this feeling that you're doing something that is meaningful beyond your own self-interest is really at the core here. To say that I'm building the house of God makes it clear to you that you are doing something which is part of something much larger than your own life, than your own self. So when you talk to athletes, at some stages they're like, I really want to win. I want a gold medal. I want to win an Olympic gold medal, right? So that's still a very personal interest. When someone says like, I'm going to show what's possible, right? Like, I'm going to bring up the next generation. I mean, these are all things where that person has expanded their horizon. And I think it unlocks a whole nother level of motivation. When you ask somebody like, how do you get up out of bed and try again and again? I feel like at some point, if it's only because it's interesting to you or if it's only because you can, refine your craft and get a little better, I think at some point that runs out. But to feel like you get out of bed in the morning for somebody who's not you, that if you get out of bed in the morning and you do your best job, that somebody else's life or the world will be a better place, then you really have unlocked, another level. And I think of passion as being not only interested in what you do, but driven by its purpose in that way. So in terms of applying this to your own life, I think sometimes, it's almost just reminding ourselves of why, we became a teacher, or, why it is that we started writing a book that, feels really hard to finish at the time. The purpose isn't something that we never thought about, but it's something that we can easily lose sight of. And so, write it down on a Post-it and stick it on your mirror, or, ask your, spouse to remind you when you doubt yourself. But I think purpose is something that it is the North Star for many of the people that I study and admire.
For me personally, the way that I've been able to apply that in my own life is with parenting, right? I've got 4 young kids, aged 1 to 10. So we're in the middle of all that fun stuff. And that after I read that, kind of that purpose, right? Like getting caught in the day-to-day things sometimes with small children can be exhausting, tiring, frustrating, but trying to point to a higher purpose with raising my kids, it's helped me a lot. So that's been something I've been able to apply to my own life from your work. And but anyways, the fourth one you mentioned is hope. And my takeaway from that was when you talked about that hope has to do with having a growth mindset, that a growth mindset and grit together. That it's not really something to do with luck, but that it's about getting back up again. And that one, yeah, I'd like to hear you maybe explain that one, because that's one that I think is a key. You've got to be able to have hope to be able to persevere, right?
There really are two kinds of hope. And I say a little bit about this, but I want to elaborate on it here. One kind of hope is like, well, I hope things turn out well. Like, I hope it stops raining. I hope the summer's not too hot. Like, I hope the economy does better, right? That's a kind of optimism. That's a kind of positivity. I don't think that's the kind that's at the heart of grit. And in particular, the perseverance half of grit. I think the hope that drives gritty people is I can do something here, right? There's something I can do here. And that's different from like, well, I hope it's sunny tomorrow. I mean, not many of us think that we have power to make it sunny tomorrow. It's going to be sunny tomorrow or it's not. It'll be a better day if it's sunny, but we don't have a lot of agency, if any, really probably we didn't know agency over the weather. But we can say like, as one of the paragons of grit that I wrote about in the book, and I'm still in touch with, as I am with actually most of them, it's Cody Coleman, right? When I met Cody Coleman, he was graduating from MIT, and he was graduating with a 4.9 out of 5 with electrical engineering and computer science degrees. But it was such an improbable thing to be hearing from this kid, because he grew up with every demographic risk factor that you can think of. Like, he statistically should have been in jail, not graduating from MIT. He's, by the way, on the cusp of graduating from Stanford. I can tell listeners now, he will be one of the first Black PhD students in computer science from Stanford in, I think, at least more than 2 decades, wow. Right? So when Cody signs off his emails, he says, "Make it a great day." Right? Like, that is not like, "I think it's going to be sunny tomorrow." Like, he's asking you to do your part to make it a great day. And that is the kind of agentic optimism, the like, you know what, there's something I can do here, that really has struck me in my long friendship with Cody, and in what powers, these people who do great things. So it is hope. But it's not, oh gosh, I hope the universe turns out okay hope. It's the hope that comes from, believing that no matter how things are going, there's always something that you have agency over, something you can improve upon. And whether that's just, smiling at the next person you see instead of frowning, or sending a nice text to someone who you think needs encouragement, or taking time to, like, when you are with one of your 4 children, like, to really be present and to really listen. None of those things cost money, and none of those things depend on the weather, and none of those things really depend on anything except for yourself. And that's the kind of hope that I think is the most meaningful kind of hope.
And it's one of these things that I really encourage people listening. You've got to read this book. I'll say I usually, when I first read a book, I'll do it on Audible, and I'll mark things I want to go back to and re-listen to as key points. And I think I average, like, on a normal book, like, I'll do like around 25 or so spots that I'll mark. But on your book, I marked like 84 because there's just so many, like, there's so many good things. Because again, it's your ability to weave in the data, the research, the stories. Like, it's just so well written.
Thank you.
But I have to ask you, since I have you on some parenting advice as well. Like, as a parent, right? As a parent that wants to have their kids, I want my kids to be gritty people. What advice do you give? I know you talk about it in the book, but what advice do you give parents on how to raise children with grit?
So here are some parenting tips for raising kids who are great. One is, like, get out of the way, right? So a lot of parents, they are, very quick to, like, rescue their kids from a problematic situation, right? Like, you forgot your history textbook. I'll order one from Amazon. Like, your teacher is kind of, like, not so great. Like, I'll send a nastygram to the principal, and, like, I'll clean that situation right up. And I'm not saying that parents shouldn't help their kids, right? Like, that's our whole job, to help our kids. But when I say get out of the way, it means that, like, when your kid can solve a problem on their own, or even just, like, with a little bit of support, it's much better that they solve the problem themselves, right? Like, before you swoop in and solve the problem, like, let them struggle a bit. Maybe they can Google where to find, like, a PDF of what they need, or maybe they can call a friend, or, some other solution that's not you solving the problem. People are, all of us, children and adults, we're all adaptive, and if you put your arm in a cast, well, your arm doesn't have to lift anything anymore. Guess what happens to that arm? It gets very weak, right? It starts to, and our children are no different. So if you want your kids to be strong, then they have to struggle a bit, and you have to get out of the way and let them do that. So that's one thing that was very hard for me to do. So I will give you a recommendation that is, especially as your kids are, going to soon be tweens and teens. So as your kids get older, and they're not babies anymore, right? And they're doing things like sports or other activities. I would say one of the things that really helped me as a mom because I had a really hard time getting out of the way, is that I signed them up for things where like they had a tough coach or they had a tough teacher who was just much better at letting them struggle than I was.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it wasn't because it's not their children. So it's like, so I think that outsourcing in a way is a reasonably good strategy for, you know, helping your kids. And I'm not saying you should find coaches or teachers that are unloving, but you know, that kind of tough love. I mean, all of us have a teacher in our life or a coach who was really tough on us, but we knew who loved us, and they are in large part made us who we are. And I think as a parent, that's partly your job, is to find those people to fill the, you know, chapters of your own children's lives.
That's great. And I review this with my wife after
Yeah.
to talk about
See
it.
what she thinks.
We could definitely need some work on there. So, and then the last thing, so there's two questions that I always ask all authors who come on. But before I ask those two questions, I've got one more where at the end of the book, you talk about the relationship between happiness and grit. So, and actually it's great you put it there, because as you read the book and you go through it, you do kind of get a feeling of like, man, as I become more gritty in my life, then maybe my life won't be as happy or carefree or go lucky, you know, things like that. So just curious if you might talk a little bit about that relationship between, okay, if I get more grit, does that mean I have less happiness in my life?
Yeah, is there a trade-off?
Is there a
Are you
trade-off?
going to be like a really successful, lonely, miserable person? Okay, so I do think it's possible to be really, really hardworking and resilient and like, you know, sort of voluntarily obsessed with what you do, all the things that I mean by perseverance and passion for long-term goals. I think it's possible to do all of that and to say to yourself and others, honestly, I am so happy, so blessed to have this life. And I wouldn't trade my life for anybody else's life, right? I think that happiness and grit are compatible. And I want to even go further than that, which is to say that, you know, just today, I was having this really happy moment. You know, I was feeling like so good. And I was thinking to myself, like, why do I feel so good? Is it because like I had a good night's sleep, or, you know, because like I had a good breakfast? And I was like, you know what? If I asked myself why I felt so good today, it was because I recently just finished this essay that I had. Tommy Lasorda, the baseball legend, passed away. And it was an opportunity for me to write about like his character and also to link it to scientific research showing that it's like some of the things that Tommy Lasorda was less famous for, but it was like really like being a loyal person, being a kind and generous person, being an honest person, being somebody who was really driven, in his words, you know, to fulfill God's mission for him to be as helpful as he could to anybody that he ever met. It was an opportunity for me to write an essay, kind of like a eulogy for Tommy Lasorda. And I wrote it for my nonprofit Character Lab. I send out, as you know, Stephen, I would email every week to parents and teachers. So I was so gratified, I guess, that I was able to use my psychology, to use my writing, to use my acquaintance with Tommy as a paragon of grit, to do something that honored a person who, to me, exemplified sterling character. And the reason I felt so good and so happy in the most profound way was not because, you know, I had earned a little money that day, or not because I had a good night's sleep. It was because I felt like I was doing something that was aligned with my deepest values and interests, and that I was doing it well. And the reason I wrote about grit and the reason I talk about grit to parents or leaders is not because I want everyone to win a gold medal or because I think status is the most important thing. It's because I think of the moments in my life where I have felt the most good, you know, the most sort of like, wow, things are going great. Like, I like who I am. It's the moments when, you know, everything is lined up, you know, that what I do well, that's good for others is good, you know, it's all there. And I think that when you develop passion and perseverance in these incremental ways, you know, you will have a day where you are crossing the street and you think to yourself, gosh, why do I feel so good? Like, I just feel great. And I do think that that's, to me, you know, more than anything else, you know, why I study grit.
Well said. So the final two questions. The first one is, someone who's listening today, what's one practical action step they could take today to develop more grit?
I was having a conversation with the chair of the board of Character Lab, whose name is Luis Von On, very gritty guy. He created this language app called Duolingo, which a lot of people have heard about. And he's brilliant, and he's a MacArthur-winning computer scientist. Anyway, here's something that he just mentioned kind of casually, and I was like, ooh, I'm going to copy that. So he said that he was listening to a podcast, and he learned that I think it was a Tim Ferriss podcast, that it's good to have a morning routine. So he started developing a morning routine, and he was adding to his morning routine. He said, Angela, my morning routine is more than 2 hours now. And I was like, Luis, that's a lot of time. How do you feel about that? He's like, it's great. I get so much done. And it's because it's a routine, he's not wasting time, making decisions, right? He's not it's just execution is incredibly efficient. And he's one of the world's most efficient people. So as soon as I heard that, the next morning, I was like, I'm going to have a morning routine. So I now have, more of a morning routine. I had one before, but I think it's much more intentional. And I'm like, okay, I really need to do quiet thinking work in the morning. So I did that this morning. And, I need to make sure that I get a little exercise in. So I got that done. So I would say that one practical thing that you could learn from gritty people like Luis Von On is that, whether it's making sure that you remind yourself of a purpose, or whether it's deliberate practice, or whatever it is that you're trying to improve, make it a routine, build it in. And I think Luis is right, by the way, that the time of day when that is easiest for many of us is the morning, not the afternoon, not the early evening, not, night, but the first thing when you wake up.
And then the last question is, and I know that some of this may be a little redundant because we've highlighted a lot, but the last thing I'd like to ask everyone is pretend that you were sitting one-on-one with someone that was just starting off in their career, and they asked you about success. So both what is success and how to be successful. How would you approach that answer?
If I could, sit down with my younger self at the beginning of my career, here's what I would say. I would say, you want everything to be perfect, and you think it's going to be a straight line if you get everything right and you do everything that you're supposed to do. But there are going to be, first of all, times where you're not sure that you're making any progress at all. There are going to be times where you feel like you're going in reverse, and there are times where you feel like you're at a dead end. So these setbacks are part of the journey. And the next time you hit one of those, you can say to yourself, you know what? Now I know I'm on a journey, because I was sort of forewarned that it was not going to be a straight shot. And so when you have a bad day, you can say to yourself, yep, this is part of the journey. Now I know that, that I'm making progress in a way, because I'm hitting bumps of the road. I'm hitting places where I have to turn hard, or that I make a mistake and I got to backtrack. So for me, as a young woman, I thought that if I tried my very hardest, it would be linear. And now I know from interviewing so many people who have lived long lives and, achieved great things, that it is not a linear path for anyone. And if I had known that then, I think I would have been a little easier on myself, and appreciated that, the journey is much more interesting in the way that it eventually and actually plays out than the way it plays out in your head before you get started.
Well, I love that answer. So thank you so much, Angela, for taking time to be with us. Honestly, your work and the way that you present things is just awesome. Seriously, it's just amazing. And I know how busy you are and how many requests you have. So it means a lot that you would hop on the podcast to do this. So again, appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I believe in the purpose of what you're doing, and I am so honored to have been with you.
Thank you.